Well, good afternoon to the latest in the Kirklees Democracy Commission's public evidence gathering sessions, and we're very pleased today to welcome John Turner. Thank you very much, John, for coming up from Norwich. Widely experienced in the machinations and progressive reform of local government, and also for your experience with Norwich City Council, but also, of course, dealing with central government and those tensions between the two. The Democracy Commission has been set up by Kirklees at an incredibly timely juncture in our political history. The summer has been seismic in its implications for not only the future of the United Kingdom, but also the sense of its impact on public culture and their engagement with politics. We also are experiencing a radical change in the governmental architecture of England since the 2014 emergence of the Northern Powerhouse, and of course the city region agenda, which is changing governmental relationships between citizens, local authorities and their regional manifestations. Of course, we've had the announcement of the East Anglia devolution deal recently, which obviously affects your own particular part of the world. And in that sense, I think that Kirklees Council should be congratulated for setting this up. I think that one of the things which has been lacking in the debates about government in England has been that local perspective. In many ways, Whitehall and Westminster have enacted reform without thinking particularly about their impact and implications for local democracy. And Kirklees, in their proactive tradition, are rightly turning to their citizens and turning to experts and saying, well, what does that mean? And I think in one sense there's been an awareness of this disjuncture between higher levels of public trust in local elected officials when compared to their national counterparts, and yet conversely you see considerably lower turnouts at local elections when compared to national ones. And the first question I want to ask is, just on a very general sense, why do you think that there is this lower engagement with local democracy from citizens and lower turnout participation in elections?
It's historic in the sense that if you look back at statistics over probably the last 30 years, it has been the case that for a national event the turnout will be roughly double that of at a corresponding local one held within the previous 2 years. But I think actually probably since the 90s, start of the 90s, perhaps earlier than that, the power of local government has changed dramatically in the sense of its decline, because whatever is said by national politicians, it always seems to end up that the powers that local government previously had somehow get diminished, either through legislation or through finance, because the second is a blunt sword, but it works just as effectively as changing the law. And I think that citizens, by and large, and certainly that seems to be the case the lower down you go, if you get down to parish level, actually believe that local councils can't actually do very much. They are so constrained by what else is going on that you end up in a situation where the power doesn't actually get vested in the people you want to use it for local reasons. And I think until there is some meaningful exchange between Whitehall and the national situation, then I can't see that changing at all in terms of what the man or woman on the street expects from their local representatives.
So it is a sense of, I think the electorate in some ways being intuitive, that they are recognising that local government has been disempowered in many ways, and so they are reflecting that with a diminishment in engagement in politics.
That's how it seems to me, and equally there is the, what should we say, over the last 20 years, this interest in combining polls at different things together, which means that you get artificially high turnout where a local election is combined with a national event, but the minute you go back to it being held alone, you drop off to the same 25 to 35%. It's very easy to make an argument that says, oh, well, we had 63% turnout, but actually that was caused by the national event, not by the other end. And you can actually almost get some stats on this if you're prepared to dig deep enough, because where there has been combination, let's say with the UK parliamentary election and local authority elections, the number of papers that are either not taken or are not used by the electorate is quite significant. You could be talking in thousands in a parliamentary constituency.
It's interesting. I just realised I do this quite commonly, that I launch into an evidence gathering session without fully introducing our panel today. We're joined by Cathy Scott, Councillor Cathy Scott, Councillor Vasily Vadia, Councillor Andrew Martington, and Councillor Andrew Polterman. One of the things that the Democracy Commission is looking at is electoral cycles and the extent to which that might have an impact on turnout. Now, it is widely noted that when local elections are held on the same day as other elections, particularly Westminster parliamentary elections, that there is a boost to the turnout because of the greater engagement at the other level. That obviously means a merging of issues, and often we find that some citizens are confused about what exactly they're voting on and which election.
Indeed.
The current trend is that it would appear that combining different elections on the same day is going to continue. The Manchester Mayor elections will be held on the same day as the local elections. And I wonder what you think are the implications for these regional elections, which are now police and crime commissioners also, for local authorities and for local democracy. Will that impact on them? Do you think it's a good thing to combine these elections? And B, what are the manifestations?
Well, I think probably the truth was in 2012 when the PCC elections were held in November against all the best practical advice that was given to the then Home Secretary, now the Prime Minister, that this was not a bright thing to do. Largely because November traditionally is not good weather. In fact, it could have been downright dangerous. And that people are unlikely to turn out for an election they know very little about. And also, much worse than that, they had really no idea about what the powers of the Police and Crime Commissioner were likely to be, because nobody had really sorted that out either. And 12% as a national turnout at a national election, I think, it just says it all for me. And consequently, I have just a sticky feeling somewhere that the new combined authorities may suffer the same fate, either because people don't actually agree with it. Quite interesting if I look at some of the consultation results in East Anglia, or because they feel that it's another tier of government that actually is going to deliver very little in terms of what you might expect. And dependent on who the commentator is on this thing, I'm beginning to see almost a turning away from this as a prospect, because the great things that were going to be delivered as a result of the devolution, actually, when you boil it down to what that would mean at a town, village, parish level, it's absolute peanuts. It's really not going to bring anything significant to the table. So then, why would you bother, in a way, to turn out to vote for something that you don't understand and which doesn't appear to bring any great benefit from a selfish perspective?
So, in many senses, these regional devolution direct elections which are going to emerge could fall into the same trap as the PCC elections, in the fact you've got a largely ill-informed electorate than sure about the different powers, concerned about more politicians, and will possibly vote with their feet rather than actually at the ballot box.
I suspect that could well be the case, and unless there is something particularly volatile and local, then voting for somebody, particularly if you take East Anglia, who is a million miles away from where you are in terms of public transport, etc., just isn't going to cut the ice, I don't think, particularly when they are not going to be able to say, I have delivered you millions of pounds worth of additional cash. It's not millions of pounds worth of additional cash, and when you do it on a per capita basis over the period of time, as I say, it comes down to a very small amount indeed.
What about Westminster elections and local elections on the same day? Do you think that's a good idea?
If I start from the other end, the local point of view, I think the great danger with that is that because lots of people vote almost in a presidential way for this, I'm going to vote for the leader who was on the television 2 weeks ago and was really impressive. I'm going to vote for that party. There is then the suspicion that good local politicians will lose their seats on the basis of a national vote. So if you take what I call the Nick Clegg effect, which where the Lib Dems won, and I do this from a local perspective, I have nothing to do with it now, but Norwich South had always been either Conservative or Labour, mostly Labour, and then suddenly the Lib Dems won it, and they won it, I think, on the back of quite a good performance by Nick Clegg in those prime ministerial debates. They managed to turn the unpopularity, as it were, of the Labour Party at that time to ensure that the candidate who won it could just slip through the two other main parties. And I'm convinced that is on the back of the national vote, because elections at Norwich City Council, no different to anywhere else, had always been in the 35% bracket, double that figure. And I think there is a sort of a swing-on effect from the National Party. And I've been in polling stations where people actually want to know who is my man, and they're not looking for the name of the local candidate if it's combined with a parliamentary, they're looking for the leader of that particular party. I just think the electorate are not that switched on when it comes to these things.
One of the things that's come out from some of our engagement with the local University of Huddersfield Student Union is that students are particularly affected by early May election dates. They have exams, they have assignments,
Sure.
They're possibly in transition, returning home. Many of our students do live in the local community, but it's about 65% don't. And therefore, it's a common pattern across the United Kingdom that in university towns and cities, actually in those central city wards and parliamentary constituencies, that the turnout dips quite severely due to the absence of student vote. Their suggestion from the Huddersfield Student Union is move the date of the election away from May to another day. And I wonder whether you have A, an opinion about the suitability of doing that, and B, are there other points in the calendar where you could hold elections and avoid disengaging with students?
You would have
potential disengagement of students, let's say. Yeah.
No, you would have to change more than just the date, because it will have an impact on other things, particularly electoral registration. I mean, the way things are set up at the moment, you have electoral registration through the autumn, a register published roughly at Christmas time, and then you're into the run-up to the local elections. If you then were to put them back a little bit, the register is even more out of date than it was. I think there needs to be a sea change here where government needs to be persuaded, and this goes back to parliamentary constituency boundaries. I know the old argument, that the register that you should use for such matters should be the last register that was used for an election. In other words, that is the point of the year, particularly true this year, when it is the most accurate it is likely to be in a 5-year electoral cycle. Now, the problem with that is that if you start to delay the date of local elections or any other election, come to that, the first Thursday in May tradition, then you're going to have to compile the register at a different time of the year, i.e. closer to the electoral event. It shouldn't be difficult to do. It's done in other jurisdictions, and Canada don't have an electoral register per se. They actually create one when they have a federal election.
Right.
So, if a country is vast and as wide as Canada can achieve that, then it should be achievable here. I'm not still sure, though, that would deal with the point, because we know that the 18 to 25 group is the group that is most apathetic and most doesn't take part in elections anyway. So I'm not sure that it would necessarily address the student situation at all.
No, well, that's interesting. It's interesting. We've not really heard that idea that it is possible, but I think the but is a very important one. By the way, councillors, yeah.
One of the other reasons is when we've done public workshops, we've discovered the fact that people want different ways in which they can vote, electronic means or anything else. What would you suggest?
What would I suggest? There is a real difficulty about electronic voting. Many people will tell you that Latvia have cracked this problem. They do it, and they do it very easily. This is absolutely true. They do it. I'm not sure about the easily bit. The problem is there is a European standard for this, you might expect, and that no country, including Latvia, have ever got anywhere near being able to prove that their electronic voting solution meets that standard. And I'm not talking about missing out by 5% or 10%. Every single electronic voting opportunity has been well short of the European standard, never mind other issues. And so the problem is that by having electronic voting, you open up a completely different can of worms, which is the potential for electoral fraud, and then, on top of that, the possibility of challenge to results. And that is because, I put it down to a very simple thing, you have not got the simplistic audit trail. When I was first returning officer at Norwich, the then Deputy Leader of the Council was a guy, and his father had been an alderman. They were absolutely steeped in politics. And this particular councillor said to me, because we tried a pilot with electronic voting, and he said, "This just doesn't work for me." He said, "I know every year I've been elected, I look at that table, and if my pile of votes is bigger than the next guy's, I'm the winner. And if his is bigger than mine, I've lost." And it's as simple as that. It's how high are the piles of paper. And he said, what I'd like to do afterwards is, when we sit down and look at this, can you show me the audit trail to convince me that I either won or lost? It doesn't matter whether I won or lost, just convince me that it is checkable. Because if it's not checkable, then how can you honestly believe that you have been elected if somebody says you haven't? And nobody has really solved that problem. And because of that, particularly in Europe now, countries that were using electronic voting are walking away from it. And the Germans have, the Dutch have, the Belgians have to an extent, the Italians can't get their system to work properly, and so forth and so on. I think we've got a long way to go to be able to demonstrate, because that's it from a practitioner's point of view. You want to be able to convince both the electorate and those elected, and particularly those who were not elected, that this is an absolutely genuine result. And at the moment I don't know of a system that actually achieves that.
It's a remarkable situation in a way, the fact that we can do our banking online, we can elect the leader of the Labour Party if we're a member of that party online, but there seems to be an issue about the security and the accountability, which is a very integral part of that, about online voting. I wonder whether you feel that the flaws of online voting are similar to those of postal voting. Is there a sense in which it is an online version of many of the problems that postal voting produce?
I don't think so. There is the potential for it, but it's not in the same way. The problem with postal voting, and it seems to be a diminishing problem to be fair, is that there is this allegation that you cannot be certain that the person whose vote was intended is the person who actually cast the vote. Now that's a very difficult matter to overcome. In terms of electronic and largely internet voting, what can happen is, of course, you can sell your vote on eBay or whatever. Not literally, because that's checkable, but you can. And I saw it in Norway when they had some trials a few years ago. That it was the young people who engaged with it, but basically they were trying to prove that the system wasn't watertight, so they were busily giving their vote to someone else to cast it, and then they could say afterwards, well, actually, I didn't vote, but it says I voted, but it wasn't me, it was, well, they'd say who it was. So I think it's a different problem. It is a different problem in terms of the security of the vote, and if you cannot secure the vote, then you've got this problem in then saying, have we got a legitimate authority that has been elected using this system? And that's a very difficult place to be.
It is, isn't it? I'm sure. I think we need to look at that in Norway still. I think that provides us with some indications of some of the weakness, Andrew.
What check is there that the person who turns up at the polling station is the one entitled to vote? Surely, actually, the postal vote system now is possibly more secure.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that I mean, I think is the important telling point. And so now what we have is this idea that identification will be required in polling stations. We've been saying this for a long time. Lots of time it is raised. The answer you get back is, well, it is the British system, and the British system is based on trust, and we all trust each other, and all the rest of it. Well, that might have been true round about when I was born, but I have to say several decades later, I'm not at all convinced that is the case. And so I suspect that within the next 5 years, certainly if what Sir Eric Pickles wants in his report happens, there will be the need for identification. And it is bizarre, isn't it? If you go into a library to get a book out now, you have to prove who you are. Yeah, it's but you can go and vote. It's really odd.
Would that then mean that we'd be able to go? Would that then mean that we'd be able to go into any polling station rather than just one fixed polling station?
Only if you were using an electronic register. So it's about. I come from the sticks of Norfolk, and some places they haven't actually got electricity yet. So the chances of them running a laptop with the register on is it's difficult. And all you need is a power cut, and you completely lost the ability for anybody to vote. So it comes down to infrastructure. Yeah.
Those are the sort of issues that when we spoke to Andrew Scanlon about the Electoral Commission, he raised very similar kind of questions. Kathy?
It was to talk about the electronic register, and the way times are changing, we're moving forward, and I just wondered if there was anything in the offing there, if we're going to go with an electronic register. You said about security, about possibly in 5 years' time using passports when you go to the local. How would that be electronically scanned, or because somebody just verifying it like that? I have issues with that too. So that there's a lot that needs to be done, I think. So.
Absolutely, and that very much came to the fore in the run-up to the referendum, where we had this massive surge of applications in the period between the May election and June the 23rd. And there were people who were registering 5 or 6 times with not trying to cheat, simply on the basis they wanted to be absolutely confident they had a vote. And the amount of extra work that caused across local authorities across the whole country, I guess, was just mind-boggling. And there isn't a system that it currently exists that would prevent that, because the one thing that the coalition government and this government has done is to follow that policy of we do not want a national database. This is the whole argument about ID cards in the first place. So we're now got back into that argument, and that is the one thing that would prevent doing the sort of thing that you alluded to, because it's not just a different polling station in Kirklees. If you had that national database, frankly, if you were in Cardiff on the day of it, there would be nothing to stop you doing it. But it is the data problem that then exists in terms of somebody sitting holding control over a national electoral register as opposed to local electoral registers. So there is a point of principle, a point of philosophy that will, I think, prevent this, certainly under the current administration's thinking.
And the other part I was going to, would you say that part of the barriers of this, because we know software develops and it moves forward and it's a continuous circle, it's outdated as soon as you use it. And is one of the barriers where we're comfortable where we're at, is it because of the cost and phenomenal systems that you can buy? You can buy a system and overnight, within the 2 months it's out of date. So is that one of the barriers?
I don't think it should be one of the barriers, because if you were to convert every local register into a national one, that's all done back office. It's not, there is nothing very clever about that. And I have this constant argument with civil servants about this, because if you think about it, the Passport Authority actually do that, DVLA actually do that, TV licensing do that. There is nothing new or clever about combining a number of individual databases into one.
One of my final questions was, we visited other authorities, and I think that the reluctance of people not feeling part of it and joining in and being registered is because we lack sharing information. Like with the DWP, you could get more people signed in, young people. Do you actually agree with that statement, that they could be part of the electoral system automatically?
Yeah.
Rather than them having to sign up, it's something that could be done.
I am actually absolutely convinced of it. I'm currently doing some work with the states of Jersey, and I know you're talking about a very different sort of electorate, 250,000 people or so. But in fact, that is what they have been doing. And in this work, we have looked at combining. They have a national database that starts with your birth, something called Populous. But the registers, it's very archaic in Jersey, actually. There are 24, I think it is, parishes, and the parishes actually keep the register. And it's not just the register of electors, it's for dog licensing, they still have that, guns, all sorts of strange things, driving licenses. So I managed to persuade them to do a check, use the populace database, which is this thing from birth to going to school to medical to all the rest of it, and start paying taxes and all that, and compare it with what the parishes do in terms of the register. 99.6% match, which convinces me, and now they're doing some more rather slightly more clever things, which convinces me that it would be as accurate an electoral register as it could ever be. There's always going to be, point something of a percent that's out. But once you've had an engagement with a citizen, you've got on for life, as it were, until you find out something different. And the Registrar of Deaths will tell you about that bit of it. So, in effect, you simply build by using the data that you've already got. Why keep going out and almost trying to contradict yourself? It's absolutely crazy as far as I'm concerned.
Andrew?
Yeah, just to touch on one or 2 points that we've already talked about. I mean, the issue about, and really what Andrew said about security of the postal vote, having witnessed both sides of the process and actually the signature checking that goes on, at least that, there is a more rigorous process in terms of checking that. And I think, again, some of what we talk about, I mean, as I understand, we went to Knowlesley the other day. I mean, I worked in Liverpool in the 80s, and there's still reminiscences of personation, I think, in the 1960s and 70s. And we're still allowed to ask the question, are you who you say you are?
Yes.
And in that sense, I think, that I think I'm perfectly comfortable with that side of things in terms of modernising what goes on. And there is an element. It's when the result gets close, you need to be able to, and that I think in certain circumstances we want to do that. I think there probably is a halfway house between if the papers. It's interesting you're talking about the physical paper trail, and there is a possibility, sort of, if somebody does vote online, to do the usual check. Actually, that sort of double checking you get. So you vote, somebody checks back on a phone, a landline or a mobile phone, to say, are you actually you say you are? There's that double checking. That's possible. But you could effectively produce a piece of paper that gets counted on the Thursday night or the Friday morning, couldn't you? And actually, just what that does, I think some of the other evidence is actually a more convenient way of doing it. And I think the other thing we talked about is actually, rather than physically counting the ballot papers, actually speeding that process up as well. I want to really go back to the issue about elections on the same day, and we talked about turnout, but actually the effect it has on the result. You gave the example of Nick Clegg. I mean, the perception I've certainly had here is actually when you have a local election, so the general election, actually it tends to skew that in favour of the national parties, the parties who are putting more resources in. And that's been a bit of an issue for me, because when Parliament Channel's been rerunning some of the historic elections, actually saying that effort to actually keep general elections away from local elections, recognising they're quite distinct things. And so we've got some of that just about when you run particularly a general election the same as a local election, it actually skews the result in more than one. So it does fit on. I suppose that's the example you gave in Norwich South, isn't it? But there's other examples.
Oh,
yeah.
And I think that we're developing a rather strange situation in the UK now, where in Scotland it's now unlawful to hold a parliamentary election on the same day as a local government one because of the problems they had in 2007. Talking to colleagues in Wales, I've got a feeling that once Wales gets more devolved power as a result of the Wales bill that is going through the House at the moment, we'll see a similar situation there, because it's quite plain that the elections to the Welsh Assembly do not sit well with the local government elections. So putting them on the same day is always potentially going to skew that in the same. You still don't know what the percentage would be. But the mere fact that Scotland has decided that on no account, whatever the circumstances, we will not have a Scottish parliamentary and have Scottish local government elections at the same time, paints a pretty big picture for me. And I think very good reasons for it.
Good. I think the other issue in terms of turnout, presumably you do see differential turnout between wards, and is it about the issues that people, so if it's a tight election in a particular ward, you might get a better turnout. If there's a particular issue in a ward which people are concerned about, does turnout vary?
It does vary. I mean, you can look across it. I've never done scientific work on this, but certainly using my experience in Norwich, where we had a situation where the Labour Party had been in control for 55 years or something, and very slowly the Lib Dems were working ward by ward by ward and doing it quite cleverly. And I said to the leader of the council, I said, you do realise if you lose 3 more seats, you're not going to have an overall majority, don't you? And he said, we're powerless to prevent it. And basically, I think what was happening was the turnout in those wards where the Lib Dems were working very hard was going above the city average. And the traditional areas where Labour stronghold was actually going down at the same time. And I think the latter was in conjunction with what was happening nationally in political terms, when people were beginning to sort of turn their backs on it almost. Whereas the Lib Dems had just done this very steady work about, and they were more concerned about potholes and issues like that than they were about anything that was even vaguely citywide. And that's what I think tends to happen when you get local activists who put an enormous amount of effort through the year in working that particular patch. You do see a lift across that particular authority's average. And oddly, it must be Norwich is a strange place. What then happened was the Greens mimicked what the Lib Dems were doing, and the Greens suddenly were winning wards back from the Lib Dems that the Lib Dems had taken from Labour. Now that bubble seems to have burst as well, so perhaps Norwich has a political...
The general pattern is that if you invest time and effort in engaging, that you will see a result. Just to sort of think about some other issues around sort of how you can get greater turnout, and we've had various suggestions made to us, some people suggesting to move the date of the election to a Saturday or a weekend, or voting over a number of days. I don't know whether you've had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I gave evidence to a select committee, crikey, a long time ago now it seems, when certainly when Labour were in power, they were looking at that, and so set up a commission. And in the end, nothing happened, largely because of the practical difficulties of how you would do it, and the fact that, and it's probably even more true now, how you relied very heavily in terms of things like polling stations on what you might call the third sector. And there was an issue about religion that came into it, in the sense that some of the things that might have been available to you on a Thursday, depending on which religion you're talking about, wouldn't be on a Friday or on a Saturday or on a Sunday. And so the whole concept of weekend voting, as it was known, became a difficult one in practical terms of how would you actually get enough venues for people to vote at. Which makes a good argument for then, well, let's have electronic voting instead, and they can all do it on their laptop at home, save an awful lot of money. And so nothing went there. Now, nothing that I've seen has changed very much. Well, actually, probably what has changed is that the number of local authority premises that are now available, and if you take out of that consideration the whole school question, and the sort of thing that has happened over a period of time where school governing bodies have been more and more reluctant to allow their premises to be used for policy, although the law permits it. I think that the problem would be worse now, not better.
So there is a problem simply with
there is a practical
sites.
There is a practical issue, and that is probably linked also to the fact of, and not tested this one, but getting people to actually staff them
the cost of that is a real factor, isn't it? I remember some suggesting that you could have polling booths in supermarkets and post offices and all kinds of venues, and again the cost implications of that, as well as the buy-in from the local supermarket, I suspect.
And the challenge is to find a post office that's open.
Do you have any opinion on lowering the voting age to 16? That is often suggested as a way of boosting turnout.
No, I don't, and the AA doesn't either, because we say that is a policy matter and it's for Parliament to determine.
Indeed. Well, do you have any other ideas about how Kirklees could think about boosting not only turnout in the local election, but also in that creating that engagement that would stimulate voters to want to participate? From your own experience.
Well, I think it is a difficult one, because unless you can persuade the electorate that there is something in it for them in terms of deciding one against another in political parties in particular, then there isn't much of an incentive for them to bother to turn out to vote, it seems. And that goes back to what I said right at the start, that because the powers of local authorities has been cut and cut and cut over a period of time, then the decision-making process at the town hall, as opposed to what is done in Westminster and passed down, becomes very, very difficult indeed. And so, somebody put it quite bluntly to me recently, that if you went back 30, 40 years, then social housing was a matter for the local authority. Now, I haven't bothered to look what the percentage of social housing is that is still within the gift of local authorities as opposed to arm's length companies or housing associations. But of course, local housing is an issue that affects everybody. If you are on the rented side of the market, you need to know that if your local authority and your councillor has no say whatsoever in the policies that are then followed for social housing, then that's another big area of control that has disappeared, or is certainly disappeared in some places. And you're seeing lots of this being eroded.
So if you think about it, because I think it's an interesting point. You're sort of seeing this in terms of the correlation between power and civic engagement and participation.
Yeah.
In that context, regional devolution deals could well see local authorities actually passing powers up to regional authorities, as well as Westminster passing down. Do you think that regional devolution may well have a detrimental or a positive effect on turnout at local authority elections?
I think you're spreading the jam ever more thinly. That's the problem. And if you look at the East Anglian thing, and I mean it's different up in Yorkshire, but where you've got two-tier principal areas, so you've got a county council, city or district council, parish council. How many tiers of government do you actually need to run local affairs? I'm a great believer. I mean, this is just personal, and I haven't really experienced it, but it seems to me the idea of unitary authorities actually works, or it should work. If it doesn't, then there is a particular problem. Having three tiers, as if in the case in the rural shires, that leads to its own problems. And if you were really looking for effective and efficient local government, then I think you need to start at the local and work out, not the other way around. Putting things together and then saying, does this work? Just another example of where an awful lot of money could get spent on administering something rather than delivering real services for the people of that area.
Oh, that's very interesting. If it's okay with the rest of my fellow commissioners, I just want to move on to a connected issue, which has been another feature of our discussions about elections, electoral cycles, and that is the question of electoral cycles itself. And, one of the questions has been about the potential that changing the cycle of elections or local elections might have an impact on levels of registration, voter registration, on voter engagement and the propensity to vote. And I just wonder, in your own experiences, whether you think that any particular model, Kirklees is obviously on the third model at the moment and is considering about all out or other potentials, whether you have any evidence that one or the other or these different models has an impact on those issues.
From a political point of view, it seems to me that there is some merit in there being an opportunity for the electorate to speak on an annual basis, or thereabouts an annual basis, to pass comment, as it were, on what their elected representatives are doing. That just seems a sort of purist argument. From an administrative point of view, clearly there are cost savings to be had if you go to all out, because you're not paying the cost. But that argument is now diluted somewhat by combining local government elections at every opportunity with a national one. And there are savings to be had from that, of course, because then government picks up at least half the cost. So the savings are not so great as they might have been 10, 15 years ago. There is what I'd also call, though, a bit of an administrative deficit that is linked to a probable lowering of the accuracy of the register. If there is no election coming up, there is not much of an incentive to be on the electoral register, particularly for local elections. And if I can put it to you in a rather blunt way, and this is a conversation I had with somebody where they are not on the electoral register, and that is largely because they take advantage of the single person council tax benefit. And I'm not going to pass any comment whether they should or they shouldn't, but as it was put to me, if I were to have an accurate return from this residence to the electoral registration officer, it would cost me about £1,400. I don't think a vote for any democratic institution is worth £1,400, and therefore my return is not as accurate as it might otherwise be. Now, if you actually take that into some sort of accuracy test, where I worked with what was then DSS in Ipswich in terms of comparing 3 town centre wards, the comparison between the electoral register, the records for council tax and the DSS benefits record were very interesting indeed. And all I would say is that the incentive of a 25% discount on your council tax can weigh very heavily in the minds of people who wish or do not wish to be democratically engaged. So there is that as an issue as well. You are actually not going to have any good reason for people to register because they've got no elections coming up for 4 years. The other problem is there is then what I call the administrative deficit, which means that the people doing electoral registration and running elections potentially will not be able to retain the same skill sets in terms of the people they use to do this work. Because if they're only having to staff polling stations every 4 years, which wouldn't be the case given our current setup, but if that was the clearest argument, then clearly the amount of training and effort and recruitment that you would have to do to get people to turn up once every 4 years to staff polling stations is going to cost as much as you are likely to save by going to all out. So for all those reasons, if my life depended on it, I think I'd advise that you stay as you are.
That is a very interesting perspective and one that we've not really heard before. Do you think that the different elect cycles have different effects beyond that very transactional issue about council tax, in terms of political culture and the way in which political parties and individual councillors might engage with citizens in terms of providing political messages, giving a sense about progress on policy matters, on manifesto pledges, and just in terms of engagement with citizens?
I think there is a difference between candidates, political candidates, and political parties here. For the candidate, they are elected for a term, which will be the same term whether you're on thirds or not. It'll still be a 4-year term. So their engagement with the electorate will be diminished by an all-out approach. For those who are on all-out every 4 years, then the administration of how they do it is going to be simpler, easier. It should be, because there is not the necessity to go door knocking in the other 3 fallow years. And I'm leaving aside the national thing. And unless I'm very much mistaken, political parties, despite what you read, they do not have the same level of activists that they had 20 years ago. So you are increasing the burden on those that are actively engaged and who are prepared to go and engage with the electorate with no additional resource, quite honestly. And I can see why it could be attractive from that perspective, because it looks to me it's getting more and more difficult for candidates, particularly at a local level, to actually engage with the electorate as large. And the number of times I hear, I'm not voting because nobody knocked on my door, which for a police and crime commissioner election with 2 million people in the pieces, it would be a really good challenge, that wouldn't it? You've got to knock on everybody's door before you can actually have the election. I'm sure you've heard it on the doorsteps, but that, it seems to be that's the golden sword that is held over your heads as candidates, that unless you engage personally with every single elector, you cannot guarantee anybody's vote. Now, how much of that is an excuse for not turning out to vote rather than a reality, I don't know, but I hear it all over the place.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Andrew?
Strangely, the irony is, of course, that when you do engage with a voter, it's election time with a leaflet, you're told you've got about 20 seconds to make an impression, because that's the length of time it takes to go from the front door to the kitchen bin. Compared to 20 years ago, though, we've got many more tools available to us to actually do that engagement. And whereas we don't necessarily need the foot soldiers out on the street now, because we've got all the social media stuff. And
and thereby hangs a tale as well that that way of canvassing, as it were, in terms of support, is used. We know it's used quite extensively. That there is a bit of a turn-off there, though. The trouble is, you get very muddled up with people selling cars, second-hand cars, and double glazing, and a few other things. And I'm not sure that the electorate is actually switched on enough to want to be dealt with in that way in terms of that political representative. It's a very different relationship, it seems to me. And so the work that's been done on this doesn't necessarily reap the same sort of benefits that I think came from the traditional way of doing it, although I readily accept that you've got to have an enormous resource to be able to go out and do that now. The world has changed, that's the reality.
Thank you.
Recently I completed my household return to say how many people within the household could vote. And you had to confirm who you were, which I was. I put the number in, and straight away the system went down and says incomplete message. So I then relogged back onto it, did it, completed it. I then received a letter to say within like 3 weeks later, you haven't completed it. And I thought, yes, I have completed it. So I went back on, tried to complete it. It says, you've already completed it. Do you have this cycle constantly going on?
Yeah,
at the moment? Is it a glitch in the programme? Because I'm not the only one. I've talked to about 10 people where they're saying the same.
I think there are different problems in different places. Really, it also goes back to the European referendum business of duplicate registrations as well. The current system, the IER system, as a matter of principle, is a good thing. Without any doubt, it's made it much more secure than it previously was, and it does work. But there is a but that it needs more attention in terms of the interface with the people we're trying to deal with. It is not a user-friendly system, and it also doesn't take account of what can happen in people's lives in terms of changes. So it's a good start.
I absolutely agree, it is a good start, but what I find is I'm a pretty fast typer, and it's timing out on me. So if you're an individual and you're trying to, I'm talking about somebody else that might be doing it, frustration, that will be a barrier. They will not do their returns.
Yeah, and I think that, of course, it depends on all sorts of things like bandwidth, speed, and all the rest of it. It's not necessarily the system of itself. It can be other things. And the fact is that I think an opportunity was missed when IER was brought in, largely because we were dealing with something like 4 or 5 suppliers of software that were not consistently able to talk to each other. Right, that's history. It wasn't done. It could have been. I think that will need revisiting. If you are going to get the sort of service that you're talking about out of this, there have got to be some amendments and refinements that stop this barrier.
I understand what you're saying when you were talking about the broadband. I actually live with a tech person that's computer literacy and has installed in the Home Office, gone all over the country, and he actually said that it was a problem with whatever the programme was. It just wasn't allowing time, and that's one of the things I think that we have to be careful with any system that we're going to introduce or do, that it allows for the person on the other end, that it might take them some time if they're registering. So.
Particularly when they're probably slightly reluctant doing it that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, there have been
I like
occasions.
speed.
There have been occasions when I've been ordering things. You know, you've got 5 minutes to complete your order, and you're just about to put your credit card number in, and it goes off. And I just think, oh, forget it.
Yes. So that's where we might have a barrier too, in the rush to be digital.
Well, that's precisely it, and that's why I say I think it's slow and cautious steps, frankly. And then
Do you think it was introduced too quickly?
I don't think it was necessarily that. I think it was a very large step to take, and it was always going to be reliant on the quality of the DWP information, because that's what you're checking against. And I'm not necessarily criticising DWP for this, because their data is only going to be as good as the information they currently got. And some of it, I mean, lots of people wouldn't interface. If you've never claimed a benefit, you don't actually interface, as I understand it, with DWP until you're about to get your pension. So you get your NI number at 15, and then when you're, well, now with the pensions going out to whatever age it is now, you know, it's like 50 years later or something before you have any other relationship with DWP. Well, the chances of that information being accurate after that period of time is, you know.
It sort of brings on to sort of wider questions about changes in the landscape of electoral administration. I mean, you know, it has significantly reformed the landscape in terms of registration, how councils administrate, you know, that information, and then in terms of voter engagement. And I just wonder whether you have any comments over those sort of broader changes on local democracy, and also with a bit of future scanning, whether you can see what are the key challenges going to be as we go forward.
Okay, there is a very significant problem. It's a time bomb just waiting to go off, and I don't know when it will go off. The truth of the matter is that since 2010, as you will know better than I, local government finance has been squeezed and is continuing to be squeezed at a rate of knots, and we have seen therefore a considerable reduction in the number of people employed within local government across the piece. The one growth industry since 2012 has been electoral administration. Most local authorities have actually increased the number of staff working on electoral administration, largely because they've had to. But the truth about that is the government, and you know, very rarely give credit to governments of any persuasion, but I do to this because they have kept their promises about the amount of money that they have put into electoral administration, largely on the back of the transition through IER to what is now business as usual, but also in terms of funding the PCC, all of the new things that are coming off, neighbourhood planning referendums, all that stuff. So this central money has been made available. My great fear of this, and this is my cynical old age being reached, is this will not continue. At some point, this money is going to dry up. When it dries up, you will still be left with an electoral administration service that is having to do more with less. And perhaps the significant thing about this is the churn rate within the profession at the moment is akin to social work. And given what happens within social work, then that, to me, is a worrying trend. And what we're actually seeing is a bit of demographics at work here. A lot of experienced people, senior people within electoral services, seem to all be retiring at the same time together. So it's like the lemmings and the cliff argument. And that is storing up problems as well. So, as I say, there is a bomb that is ticking somewhere, and when this Parliament comes to an end and the money dries up, then trying to keep electoral administration at the level it is will become a very serious challenge for local authorities. And I mean serious, because there has been this cushion of significant amounts of money that will not go on forever.
Is there anything that Kirklees could do to, in some ways, mitigate these problems, beyond, obviously, financial resources?
Well, it's difficult to think what they may be, because you're actually not even mastering your own house here, if I might say so. What I'm beginning to see is that local authorities are competing with each other in terms of getting, what should we say, the most reliable, well qualified, whatever it is, staff. And so you are getting some really strange things happening. And got something going on in the West Midlands at the moment that is, well, it's almost unbelievable what's happening within 3 authorities there. So I don't think it is a matter of what Kirklees can do other than work closely with its neighbours, perhaps, and come up with some way of ensuring that the poaching that is currently going on between authorities doesn't continue at the rate it currently is.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, one of the areas where we've been looking at is the role of young people in local democracy, and as one of the byproducts of the introduction of IER has been the emergence of groups like Bite the Ballot, who have been very active on university campuses and in communities in trying to get young people to sign on the electoral register. And there does seem to be a discrepancy between the preparedness of young people to sign upon the electoral register and then for them to actually go to the ballot box and vote. And we've seen that both in the European Union referendum recently, also the Scottish independence referendum, Scottish parliamentary elections. I was talking to someone last week from the Electoral Commission in Scotland, and they did a survey where 78% of young people aged 16 and 17 claim they voted. Only 69 actually registered to vote, and it's probably likely that about 48% actually voted. And I just wonder whether your experience about particularly young people and electoral registration, whether you think that the current approach, which is to, by the look of it, to contract out to Bite the Ballot much of the responsibility for this engagement work, and then the problems of getting young people to go from registering to voting. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
I have no panacea, that is for sure. There is, this isn't a problem. It's been one that is a trend that has been continuing for 30 years or more, and I cannot see that there is any one solution that would change this, quite honestly. I think it has become almost part of the culture now that the 18 to 25 group are always going to be at the bottom of the league table in terms of the percentage that turns out to vote. And that, I think, has as much to do with their attitude towards society generally as it does to democracy in particular. And lots of people much more clever than I have come up with things that might happen, and none of it has actually stemmed that tide. And it's difficult to see what it might be, and whether it's, some people would argue that it's because of the electoral system, the voting system, that it's, first past the post is not truly representative of society, all that, or whether it's down to other things about people being disengaged with politics in general. Very hard to say, but the truth is that nothing that I've seen being done has translated an increase in the number of people engaging in voting as opposed to getting registered. And you really do sort of have a bit of a problem here that that often people will get themselves registered for reasons that have got absolutely nothing to do with voting.
That's a very interesting point.
Getting a mobile phone.
Yeah, very practical elements to that, which is sort of kind of lost in the narrative. And do you think it's a good idea that the government is giving money to national organisations such as these are the ones I mentioned, but other ones, rather than passing that funding down to local governments for local initiatives?
I suppose I ought to say I think it's better if they give it to local authorities, but the truth
No, that's right.
But the truth of the matter is that however much good work goes on by the civil society organisations, it has limited impact because the amount of money actually is quite small. And to do a national campaign that was meaningful would cost an enormous amount more than is currently available or is handed down. And equally, as you rightly just said, measuring the results of it is almost impossible. So you can't actually do a value for money test further down the line.
Yeah, it's interesting. Andrew?
You touched on the electoral system and some of the things we've been asked. One of the questions we've been asking other people giving evidence is about single transferable votes. And I suppose 3 things about that. Sort of one, turnout, impact on turnout. We've got it in Northern Ireland, the Scottish local elections. Connection between the electorate and who they vote for. I suppose particularly from your point of view, actually in terms of administering STV elections, is it straightforward to administer the count and that people actually understand that process, both from an administrative point of view, but from a point of view of the electorate and actually not the politicians who are taking part in it?
My experience of it is limited to Ireland, and
Is that Northern Ireland?
I've seen it in the Republic as well.
Yeah.
And generally, people understand it. The voter, I don't see difficulties with once they're used to what it actually means. It's almost an insult to the electorate to say that it's too complicated for them to understand. They do understand it, just as they do with other systems like AV and SV. The problem from an administration point of view, as you will know, is it takes a lot longer to get a result. There is ways of shortening that process, but it goes back once again to electronic counting rather than voting. And SDV is regarded as likely to be the fairest system of PR, but it is very complex in terms of how you then arrive at a result. And whether that would be more of a turn-off for people. People love everything to happen quickly, don't they? So you want to be, I can't say Sunderland anymore, you want to be Newcastle and get the results out before the polls have closed, or whatever the latest standard is. And that seems to become the be-all and end-all of things. My take on this is I actually would like to see a complete and accurate result, and if that happens to take 6 hours, well, that takes 6 hours. That's just how it is, guys.
So 6 days, or a few days.
Well, you see, that's the problem with it, isn't it? And the more you mix the electoral systems up, if you take the Wales example this year, where you were having to wait till Monday to get results in the lowest tier, that is something that doesn't fit the lifestyle and speed with which we live these days. Everything has to be now. So I don't think there is any impediment to introducing different systems. People will cope with them, whatever you introduce. I think the real problem is when you mix them all up on the same day. So, right, guys, this is first past the post, and there's an STV, and you have an AV there and an SV on this one. If you took the thing in Bedford last year 2015, where they had 5 different polls on one day, including the council tax referendum, the public coped with it, but actually, was it really fair, and was it a good result, given the number of spoils? Probably not.
If you could give a figure on the number of elections that a maximum number that should be held on one day, what would that be, do you think?
Well, the Law Commission quizzed us greatly on this when they were doing their work on changing the law, and we came down to all sorts of complicated almost algorithms that you would need to put in. And I don't think it is not as simple and as easy as saying X opposed to Y. It's to do with the different types of system that you're using. If you push me hard on it, I would say 3. 3 ought to be enough. But as Bedford proved, you can actually do 5. Whether it's satisfactory, then is a bigger issue.
Experience in Scotland would say that there's other things as well around that as well. It's a very complicated area, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Yes. Okay. Just to sort of move on and think about one of the questions which has come up with our engagement with the general public has been about this tension between individuals as representatives of particular wards and then individual elected representatives as representatives of political parties. And the tension in the way that impacts on voter turnout. And the general view has been there is more of an engagement with the individual and the representative of the ward than they are as a political party. It seems that it reflects that sort of fraying of identification and connection with political party politics more widely. I just wonder what you think has been the impact on voter engagement and also the potential in the future, as if this trend continues, for the way in which local democracy will function. And I'm thinking this in this, and also in the context of the tension between representative and participatory democracy, the idea that the role of councillors is changing.
I think that there is a real tension here, and that is around if you said, right, we're going to ban political parties, and therefore everybody's got to be independent, what would happen? Hard to say. The fact of the matter is, to compete against a political party, for an independent, that is a real challenge. So if you take away the tag of political party in this, I don't think it would necessarily improve the nature of how governance happens. Largely because you come back to the financial argument. If you're going to do campaigning in any sensible shape or form, it's going to cost money. And I don't know how you would achieve a level playing field unless you so squash the amount that could be used as to make it meaningless. And go back to my point about I didn't get a leaflet, so I'm not going to vote sort of argument. If you take it a bit wider as to therefore what does the elected person do once they are elected, and how answerable are they to the community, it's quite interesting. I was recently over in the Isle of Man for their general election, and they do not have political parties. Well, they do, but they don't call it that. It's a very strange setup. But mostly they are literally independent of politics. So you then get personality coming into it in a big shape or form. And it was very interesting. The results there didn't match up to what has previously happened. And so some people with who thought they were well loved by their electors found that they weren't as well loved as they thought, and other people who have been involved in some other form of society but had built a bit of a reputation for getting things done suddenly found themselves as members of the House of Keys, when I don't think they least expected that as a and then you get into the really very difficult area of politics working in a sort of comprehensive way, because they then had to elect a chief minister because he decided he wasn't he had the previous one had enough, really.
That's right, yeah.
In truth. So then, because you haven't got a political structure to it, it becomes very, very difficult to find enough people to support one candidate to actually take on this role. And if you take that into how political groups work, and the way in which there is that sort of discipline within parties, if you just did away with it, then you could end up with the sort of situation in the Isle of Man. I just would hate to think what would happen to government. How would you ever get a decision about anything? It's fine when you're talking about feral goats on the top of a mountain. That's really quite interesting. But when you're actually trying to set the council tax rate and you've got 48 different people, different views, I just think it would be such a cultural change that it would have the effect of disengaging the electorate even further.
Right. Well, if we're in the Isle of Man views, there are feral goats in Kirklees as well. Well, that as well, and the occasional feral councillor. Just to sort of push that on, and just sort of think about it in this sort of tension between the personnel and the role of the councillor, and this sort of tension between party politics and the individual. And think about it in terms of civic knowledge. And there seems to be, from much of the evidence we've taken from both stakeholders, experts, and from the general public, a concern about this lack. There is a lack of civic knowledge about how local government works, about its connections with national government, and the role of the citizen within that context. And just, from your, not only just your experience in the United Kingdom, but also obviously working across various parts of the world, how does the English approach compare, and is there ways in which we could, in some ways, get a more engaged, knowledgeable citizenry in Kirklees?
I think it would be quite difficult, in the sense that you are but part of the wider society, the wider political culture. And my take on the British model and the way it is impacted in a third of the world, largely the British Empire, is that people in other parts of the former empire, the Commonwealth now, have different motivations for being engaged with politics. And some of it is about the basic needs of life, to be blunt. If you go to places where I've been in Africa, people will, they will, very humbling, they'll walk 8 hours to vote. If you're up near Kimberley or somewhere on the South African-Namibian border, if that's your nearest polling station, they'll walk it. And why will they do that? Well, because they believe, and to a degree it is true, that the local politicians can make or break how they lead their lives. And fundamentally, that is not actually the case within Kirklees or anywhere else in England or the UK, as far as I can work out. There isn't the same incentive. And it really doesn't matter. So they're quite happy to leave it to the 30% who will turn out and vote, and unless something really fundamental happens. And you only actually ever see this, I hate to say it, at a very, very local level. Where I live is the sticks of rural Norfolk, and the parish council always gets elected unopposed until they foolishly agreed to, in what happened, to agree to recommend the district council to approve an application for 3 wind turbines. And then a parish meeting was called, and they nearly had to hire Carrow Road to get everybody in to have us their say when nobody ever goes to the parish council. But you do something that is going to affect someone's lifestyle, particularly the place where I live, and all hell breaks loose. And then you get 150% turnout for the next parish council election, because the 7 people who foolishly said yes, we recommend this, I'll bet you come whenever the next one is, 2017, they'll probably not get elected.
So politics has to matter to get that level.
That's my belief, and if it doesn't matter unduly, you're quite happy to let everybody else do it and worry about it until it does affect you. That, I think, is the sharp reality of where we're at, and why what has been well accepted, the mother of democracy and all that, is not as real and relevant as it was perhaps in 1872 when the Ballot Act was brought in to stop the rotten boroughs. The world, or this country, is in a different place now.
No, that's a very interesting comparison. I think that in some ways it offers a final question, if it's okay with my fellow commissioners, which is your experience on an international scale of many of the issues that we've been talking about today, particularly about voter engagement, registration, electoral cycles, and what motivates people to vote. I just wonder, in terms of the questions we're asking, are there international comparisons that we should be looking at, international examples where Kirklees may learn from how other local authorities are approaching many of these issues?
Nothing springs immediately to mind, largely because most of the things that I have done over the years has been at a national level. So if it is in Angola or Namibia or wherever it is, you're talking about the national elections and not the way local authorities work.
Right.
I think the best example I've seen where local authorities have had a meaningful role to play in change, it was in South Africa, where after years and years of apartheid and all that went wrong with that, and minority rule, suddenly for the first time people had the power in their hands, and so certainly in communities which were 95% black, so suddenly those people could actually make decisions that affected their lives. And that change was humbling, as I said earlier, about watching people vote, but to watch that actually happen. Now, I haven't been back, that was 94 or whatever it was, I haven't been back since to see the measurement. I suspect the economic situation there has curtailed a lot of the good work that was going on. But I have got a meeting next month with a very good friend who's the Human Rights Commissioner of South Africa, and she has promised to bring me up to speed with what's happening locally in South Africa now. I take it from the tone of her emails that it is not a good news story.
Right. Oh, right. Well,
that is simply to do with money. The money has run out.
There were interesting things happened earlier this year. Interesting things in the local elections in South Africa.
Indeed.
Tensions between local and central.
Absolutely right.
Many of the questions are very common to for the Western liberal democracies, but also more emergent democracies as well. And I think that's what's made our work very interesting. Well, we are coming to the end of our time. Thank you very much. We do tend to put our witnesses through quite the mill. An hour and a half is a considerable time. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm, your openness, and your ideas, and we're very grateful for them. The way we see Democracy Commission is that this is a conversation rather than simply a sort of one-off stop where we dip our cup into your proverbial font of knowledge. And in many ways, because we think it's a better way for us to develop our work. So we're carrying on now till the end of October at least, taking evidence from stakeholders, and we are then going to be retiring to a darkened room where we are going to draw up a draft report. We would like to send that to yourself if possible for two reasons. One is so that we can check that we have captured your ideas and thoughts accurately and that you're happy in what we're stating. But also in terms of recommendations, we're very keen for those that have come to our witnesses to give some feedback on those before we then submit them in the new year to Kirklees Council, and then more nationally engage with various groups about some of our conclusions. So hopefully you'll be able to do that for us.
Be glad to.
Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much for travelling in from lunch. And for now, good afternoon.
Thanks. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.